Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 41, The Royal Birthday Party. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Louis and Pippin attacked Lothar, forcing him to release their father from the monastery, and he became emperor again. The fighting did not end immediately, and several relatives of Bernard of Septimania were killed. Still, Lothar could not face his father and his two brothers, so he retreated across the Alps to the safety of Italy. Since the emperor was too busy with family squabbles to defend the empire's borders, Vikings raided the trade center of Dorestad. Even so, none of the empire's neighbors were strong enough to invade the empire. Since the emperor had not forgiven Pippin for imprisoning him during the first revolt, Louis appeared to have become the dominant son. However, the emperor did not react well when Louis asked his father for greater independence. Worse, the emperor gave 14-year-old Charles full authority over his lands, signaling that Charles had become the emperor's favorite. Maybe Louis would have accepted the consolation prize of second favorite son, but he found himself slipping to the position of third favorite son. It is worth emphasizing that the competition between the various sons of the emperor was not merely a sibling rivalry, but a very serious issue for the many nobles who actually governed the empire. In the later feudal era, lords could have lands in several kingdoms. The situation would often be awkward and repeatedly fuel conflict, but the issue of divided loyalties was accepted, if not welcomed. However, Carolingian succession rules specifically forbade a lord from swearing loyalty to two kings, so the inability of the rival kings to calmly settle borders meant that many nobles in the eastern region were faced with having to give up large parts of their domains. Anyway, the Frankish nobles were summoned to an assembly at Nijmegen in June 838. It would be more accurate to describe the assembly as a royal birthday party. Charles would turn 15 and would receive a sword in a ceremony that announced that he was old enough to fight on the battlefield. Held on Charles's birthday, the assembly was clearly about Charles, but also about young Louis, since he would attend as Charles's patron. Suddenly, the emperor announced that he was suspicious about young Louis. However, this announcement should not have been a surprise, since two key advisors of the emperor were rivals of young Louis, Archbishop Ottgar of Mainz and Count Adalbert of Metz. Why did they dislike Louis? Honestly, they may have liked him as a person. However, each man held extensive lands on both sides of the Rhine River. That region had been promised to Lothar back in 817, but Lothar's status as an heir was in doubt. As the emperor's opinion of Louis improved, so did the likelihood that his share of the inheritance would increase. If Louis received control of the region east of the Rhine, then Ottgar and Adalbert would have to give up their lands in the east because nobles could only swear loyalty to one king. However, if Louis was confined to Bavaria, then they would keep their lands and everyone would be happy. Well, not Louis, but that was not important to them. So Ottgar and Adalbert whispered into the ears of the elderly emperor. The recent meeting between Louis and Lothar was a gift, so they somehow convinced the emperor to keep Lothar in nominal control of those lands. So Louis was no longer a contender for favorite son, and he seemed to have lost the consolation prize of second favorite son, despite all of his hard work supporting his father's plans, even when they made no sense. Angry that he was being sidelined, Louis made a public protest, expecting that the emperor would back down. But the emperor reacted badly. The birthday party was cancelled, and young Louis lost most of his lands, keeping only Bavaria. Again, a new assembly was held a couple of months later, and Charles received his sword. Pippin was the only male royal present, and Adalbert's brother, Count Otto, became Charles's guardian instead of Louis. The emperor was planning how to formally divide the empire between Lothar, Pippin, and Charles when young Louis revolted. Again, naturally, Louis was opposed by an army led by Adalbert of Metz, who wanted to keep the emperor's favor. More important, the emperor had gathered an army and marched east. Faced with the imperial army and troops led by Adalbert of Metz, Louis's resistance collapsed. He attempted to fortify the east side of the Rhine, but the imperial army managed to make it across the river, and most of Louis's followers deserted him. After Louis finally submitted around Easter, he was permitted to return to Bavaria. While Louis's brief revolt had been crushed, it is doubtful that anyone believed that the situation had been resolved. Remember, this was the third time that Louis had revolted in roughly 5 years. Still, the situation was stable, except a more immediate problem had appeared. Pippin had always been a minor player, but he died on December 13th, 838. Suddenly, the succession needed to be adjusted. Technically, Pippin's lands should have gone to his eldest son, 16-year-old Pippin II. Obviously, Pippin would require adult supervision for a few years, but there was no need to tell a scribe to redraw the maps. Except the emperor decided to change the succession. Again, Charles had come of age, so Louis had to decide what lands to give to his youngest son, and Aquitaine seemed like a good choice. However, the emperor seemed to realize that he would not live forever, so he decided that it was time to improve relations with his eldest son. So Lothar crossed the Alps in May 839, meeting with the emperor at Worms. Shortly after Louis had been defeated, Lothar publicly asked for his father's forgiveness and was forgiven again. It would be nice to imagine that it was a touching scene where the eldest son had a heart-to-heart talk with his father and was invited to come to family dinners again. Most likely, Lothar had to publicly humiliate himself, which would have been an unpleasant experience, but it soon proved worthwhile. Once Lothar was forgiven, he received the eastern half of the empire, and the western half went to Charles, leaving only Bavaria to King Louis. It is unlikely that Lothar thought that this was an ideal solution. However, Lothar had few options, so he agreed, even though he probably resented having to share the empire with his brat half-brother. Nothing actually changed in reality, but Lothar now had an official claim to the eastern half of the empire. In fact, the emperor attempted to link Lothar with Charles through marriage alliances. Charles's only full sibling Giselle was married to Eberhard, Duke of Friuli, who was a major supporter of Lothar. That same year, Judith, his brother Conrad, married Adelaide, Lothar's sister-in-law. These two marriages strengthened the network of supporters for Charles. For some unknown reason, Pippin II of Aquitaine received nothing. Literally nothing. To be clear, the emperor had basically ignored the capitulary of 817, which had stated that if one of the sons died, then his lands would be given to his son if he had one. Most of the nobles in the empire accepted the situation, since their lands remained untouched. Louis and Pippin were the main losers, but Louis was struggling to retain the loyalty of his followers after his most recent defeat, so he did not revolt. The situation was different in Aquitaine, where many followers of Pippin did not accept Charles's claim to Aquitaine. So Pippin would fight his grandfather to keep his father's lands, but he needed an ally. Fortunately, he found one. Bernard of Septimania. Yes, this is the same Bernard of Septimania, who had been a loyal supporter of the emperor's second wife, Judith. Unlike many of his relatives, Bernard had survived the initial revolt by the sons against their stepmother and her family, where the emperor had been imprisoned. However, Bernard had never regained his influence at court, so he was unsurprisingly willing to help Pippin revolt. Well, the emperor had little choice. The revolt had to be crushed. Actually, he did have a choice. He could have admitted that he had treated his grandson badly. A little awkward, but it was a big empire, and Pippin would have probably been satisfied with Aquitaine. Maybe not happy, but unwilling to revolt. Instead, the emperor and Charles marched into Aquitaine with an army. So Charles first experienced war fighting against fellow Carolingians, which was especially embarrassing since the emperor had been based in Aquitaine for decades. In the end, the fighting was led by the emperor, so Charles did not gain much experience. In theory, the imperial army would crush Pippin's revolt, but Louis had also revolted in the east, and Adalbert of Metz lacked enough followers to defeat him, so the emperor had to march east. First, he celebrated Easter at Aachen. The celebration was probably grim, since his wife and his youngest son were still in Aquitaine, dealing with his grandson's revolt, while his second youngest son had also revolted, and Lothar was still in Italy. Still, the emperor was determined to have peace, or at least no more revolts. So after Easter had been celebrated, he marched east. Faced with the imperial army, young Louis fled back to Bavaria. Great, the empire was peaceful, at least for the moment. Honestly, little had changed. Lothar and Pippin at first revolted against their father in 830, supported by influential nobles angry that they had lost a power struggle with the family of Louis's second wife, Judith. Still, the revolt was soon settled and Lothar was exiled to Italy. Then Pippin revolted again a little over a year later, joined this time by Louis, the third son. Hoping to restore harmony in the family, the emperor held an assembly in 833, but his three sons united and placed him in a monastery. Fortunately, the three sons could not remain united for long, so Louis was emperor again a few months later. While Louis's residence in the monastery had been temporary, this revolt had been relatively bloody, at least bloody enough for a chronicler to record a battle and the names of the nobles killed. Possibly the violence shocked everyone since there was peace for a few years. Then Louis revolted again but was quickly defeated. Finally, Pippin died in 838 and the emperor decided to give Pippin's lands to Louis's fourth son Charles rather than Pippin's son, conveniently named Pippin. So Pippin revolted against his grandfather, then Louis revolted again. Over the course of a decade, there had been 5 or 6 revolts, increasingly violent, although none had led to a full-scale civil war. Despite the growing instability, nothing had changed. The emperor still faced revolts from family members, but he could not force them to submit for long, and he refused to actually give them their own lands. Honestly, the names had not even changed, since Louis's son Pippin had been succeeded by his son Pippin. It is worth pointing out that Emperor Louis was old. These revolts were his own fault, and he was lucky that none of the empire's neighbors could take advantage. Still, the emperor must have wondered what would happen when he died. Or maybe he was just too tired to think ahead. Or at least further than arranging the succession, since he was on his way to a planned assembly at Worms in May 840 when he became ill. The emperor died on June 20th, 840, after confirming that Charles and Lothar would divide his kingdom. His arch-chaplain was his half-brother Bishop Drogo of Metz, who was with him when he died. Over the course of roughly a century, Charles the Hammer, Pippin, and finally Charles the Great had relentlessly expanded the borders of the Frankish kingdom until it had become an empire. As I have mentioned repeatedly, there was no reason why Emperor Louis would not have continued to expand the borders, but he had failed to unite the nobles behind him. Instead, he had spent much of his reign dealing with revolts by one or more sons and had barely managed to survive as emperor until he died. Admittedly, there was a clear succession, but there was little guarantee that the succession would be honored. Unlike Louis's own succession to Charles the Great, Lothar's position was far less stable. He was the official heir, yes, but he had 2 living brothers. Following the emperor's death, Lothar promptly claimed the entire empire for himself, ignoring his recently deceased father's precise instructions. Honestly, was this a surprise? Lothar's grandfather Charles the Great was on the verge of war with his younger brother Charlemagne until Charlemagne had conveniently died, and Lothar's great-grandfather Pippin had gained full control after his brother had decided to enter a monastery, possibly fearing a war with his brother. Finally, Louis had always worked to keep the empire united. Technically, he had succeeded, since the empire still existed as a single unit when he died, but it was a good question what would happen next. So, Lothar was emperor. As I already mentioned, his key advisors Hugh and Matfred had died a year earlier, but he had attracted new followers, including Count Adalbert of Metz and Archbishop Otgar of Mainz, old enemies of King Louis. So, in the late summer of 840, the new emperor held an assembly near Mainz, but neither Charles nor Louis attended. Concluding that Louis was the more dangerous brother, Lothar marched with an army into Louis's territory to remind everyone that he was emperor. Meanwhile, Louis had assembled his own army to remind his followers that he was king. The 2 armies found themselves on opposite sides of a river, but neither side was willing to cross the river and start a battle. Instead, the 2 brothers agreed some form of peace, even though everyone undoubtedly knew that it would be temporary. Lothar could have forced a battle, but either the odds were not favorable, or his nobles were not eager to slaughter relatives. Swallowing the shame, he accepted an armistice which gave Louis time to strengthen his control over eastern Frankia. What was happening in Aquitaine while Lothar and Louis were staring at each other across a river? Emperor Louis had not fully pacified Aquitaine when he left because his men were ill. Left to rule Aquitaine, Charles was trying to strengthen his position when he learned that his father had died, so he would find out whether all of the nobles in the western part of the empire would honor their promises to the emperor now that he was dead. It did not take long for the nobles to make up their minds. Most of them ignored their vows and swore allegiance to Lothar. To be fair, they had little choice since Lothar had threatened to take away the estates of any noble who remained loyal to Charles. Still, enough of Charles's nobles remained faithful that Lothar finally agreed to meet with Charles in November 840. Most important, none of the nobles were willing to fight for either claimant. Another temporary peace was arranged, and then it was too cold to fight, so everyone went to their homes to ride out the winter and plot. Clearly, Lothar's reign as emperor had not started well. Most of his time had been spent marching first to the east and then south to Aquitaine in order to remind his brothers that he was emperor. While Lothar had failed to convince his two brothers to recognize him as emperor, his situation had improved. Remember, Lothar had been confined to Italy for most of the previous decade. Now he controlled the heartland of the empire and he could call himself emperor. To sum up, the emperor's favoritism towards Charles and Lothar drove Louis to revolt, although it was a minor revolt compared to previous revolts. Then Pippin died. Technically, his lands should have gone to his son, also named Pippin, but the emperor decided to give Aquitaine to his son Charles. So Pippin revolted against his grandfather, and Louis revolted again. These revolts seemed unlikely to succeed, but the elderly emperor died on his way to deal with Louis. Lothar became emperor, but decided that he did not want to divide the empire with his surviving brothers. Naturally, they insisted, which meant that there would be more conflict. Since Charles was busy dealing with Pippin, Lothar marched east to force Louis to submit. However, their followers did not want to fight each other, so there was an armistice. As ever, the key problem remained. Lothar wanted to be emperor, and his brothers did not want to bend the knee. Obviously, Lothar would focus on one brother first. The question is, which brother? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.